The thin air of pure actuality. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Al Person. We're going to have a bit of fun today. I'm going to take you to a thin air kind of topic. And if I've got a bit of time, I'll take some pot shots at Christian evangelists and so on who say they have gone to heaven and come back to tell about it. So we'll see how much time I have today. The thin air, that's related, by the way. So what do I mean by this? Well, the topic, the place we're going is kind of one of those places where the equivalent on Earth might require a bit of a breathing mask. You're going to get away from the earthbound view of things. We'll look again at an element of the mystery of God that is one of those things that enthralls me, that I want to get better and better at understanding and better at communicating. So what we're looking at today is I guess you could say an attribute of God, if you will, or a description of God that is, once you hear it, you say, I fully get this, or I kind of get this. But if it's not ever heard or taught, it's sort of a kind of mystery territory in your mind. What we're talking about is pure actuality. In Latin, actus purus, or actus purus, I guess. Purus probably would be correct. We're saying that God is actus purus, which is to say that he is eternally all that he can be. God is eternally all that he can be. The opposite of actuality is potentiality. That is, something could potentially be something else. Potentiality is a trait of creatures, not of God. Okay? So God, we understand, is all that he can be. In the book of 1 Kings, there's an encounter that Elijah has with the prophets of Baal. And you probably know the story. He says to the prophets of Baal, you bring your sacrifice, I'll bring mine. You call on Baal to bring down fire from heaven, and I'll call on Yahweh to bring down fire from heaven. And the God who answers is the true God. So the prophets of Baal start, and they start screaming and shouting and dancing and cutting themselves, and there's no fire, and the event does not work well in their favor, because Elijah prays and God sends fire. That's not something you and I can do at all times. It's or ever. It's something that God specifically empowered Elijah to do at that time. So don't go calling down fire from heaven. Okay, let's have a look at how Elijah taunts the prophets of Baal and what he says about their God. It's quite interesting here. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a God." Either he is musing, discussing something, or he's relieving himself, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. The interesting thing about this particular taunt of Elijah's is that it puts the created order opposite to the divine order. All of these qualities of Baal are very much the qualities of a created being, something that's limited in space, something that's limited in time, something that has physical needs. And so Elijah's taunt is more than just a taunt. It is a demonstration of who God is, that God is completely other to the created order. Now, if you go back to my Doctrine of God series, or if you're familiar with the Doctrine of God, there are three elements upon which this pure actuality best rests. Now, pure actuality rests on all of the attributes of God. It doesn't separate, but there are three elements upon which it best rests for our understanding. How shall I? That's probably better. Pop them on the screen. That is divine immutability, the fact that God cannot change. That's the principal one here. Divine otherness, that God is totally other to his creation, not on a scale with anything in the created order. And divine simplicity, and that teaches that God is not made of parts, that all of his parts, there's no dependent part one on another. You might remember when I talked about divine simplicity, I used a small clamp that I had in my workshop somewhere, and I noted that if you take any one of those items away, the clamp is no longer a clamp, that all those items are dependent on each other, and that they had to be assembled in a sequence and in a certain way to work. So that the fact that this compound thing was complex in these terms, not simple, meant that something outside of it had to assemble it. When you talk about divine immutability, we talk about the fact that even though God is personal, interacts with his creation on a personal level, and ultimately personal level, he does not change. and we spoke about that earlier on. We're going to be doing some more work on divine immutability, particularly in relating to this topic. And finally, otherness is the attribute of God. Attribute of God that says that God is not on a scale. So in other words, one thing is fast, another thing is faster, something is faster than that, and God is ultimate fastest. No, God is not on a scale in any way with his creation. Now, all of these things are the easiest of the attributes of God, at least in my mind, to help us understand pure actuality or divine actuality. First of all, just let's look at some things the Scripture does say that God says in revealing himself. We'll pop some of these on the screen. You've seen them before, but here we go. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great in power. Justice and abundant righteousness he will not violate. So this is Job saying the Almighty cannot be found, cannot be understood with the senses. He's great in power. Further, Isaiah 40:28, have you not known, have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. So we have this sense that God cannot be searched or understood, but also if you think about Elijah's taunt of the prophets of Baal, God does not faint or grow weary. Okay, so, and let's go to 1 Timothy 6:16, who alone has immortality, who dwells in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion. Amen. So this speaks about the eternality of God, the fact that he cannot be seen or contacted with the senses in any way. Now, those references come from my talk on otherness, but bearing in mind that we've just noted that these three qualities, immutability, otherness, and simplicity, best help us understand pure actuality. Okay, how was that for an introduction? Okay, if God becomes something, he's no longer immutable, or he's not immutable. So if there was a time when God was not something, and then God as God became something, that implies that he has changed. He's not immutable. Okay, so that's really important. If God becomes something or changes over time, he's like things in the created order. Now that makes sense too, doesn't it? In the created order, things change. That you might have something that's like a diamond, which doesn't appear to change, yet its position can change, its temperature can change. You hit it hard enough, it will change. It had to be cut. It's still changeable. Even the hardest substance around still changes temperature, can still change its position. It can still change. Okay, so God cannot change. So if he does change, that makes him like the created order. And finally, if he becomes something, that would suggest that there are parts of him that are not equal to him, that some element of him is not like another part or is subject to the other parts of God, and that violates divine simplicity. Okay, how's that? How did I go? Now, Thomas Aquinas is probably the first Christian to put together this doctrine, this sense. Now, I'm not what they call a Thomist. I'm not I don't fully agree with everything that Thomas Aquinas taught or understood. Nevertheless, he's a titan of Christian intellectual thinking in the past. Certainly, you need to read Aquinas if you want to get your head around why the church considers so many things it does today. But there are some elements of Aquinas on things like divine simplicity and that I don't think he understood at the time. Nevertheless, it's a tough read and there's a lot to do to understand it. And hey, the air is pretty thin up here. Now I've got some notes on the side. I'm going to read this here. I'm not going to pop it on the screen. It says, I've said this, in terms of God's freedom in acting, Aquinas is very clear that there is nothing that determines what God does. There's nothing that determines what God does. Are you with me? There can be nothing that determines that he do certain things. Because if this were the case, something would have to exist before him in order to determine what it is necessary that he do. And I, me, Al Person, along with Thomas Aquinas, think this is impossible since he, God, is the first and only necessary being. Okay? So this point is probably the crux of the issue in terms of understanding the fact that God is pure actuality, pure action. There's nothing that determines what God does. Okay, God does what he does. Now, we call him the necessary being, and you note that I have these 7 points that I like to use all the time in discussing all of this about God being necessary. I'm going to review it. What's my time? Not too bad. I've printed these off and got them in my hand because if I quote them from memory, they won't be the same way that I always like to read them off to you. So we get from the Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit, from nothing, nothing comes. This is the way we're going to approach this. We do approach God as the necessary being, the being that has to be there. There was a time when any particular thing was not. In that case, something other than that particular thing caused it to be. So there was a time when my folder was not. In that case, something other than my folder caused it to be. Nothing can be self-caused, or it would bring itself into being. Even an omnipotent being cannot cause itself to be. Even God cannot cause himself to be. He would have to exist before he existed. Okay? An existing thing cannot have a non-existing thing as its cause. Nothing can have nothing as a cause. Okay? Nothing can have nothing as a cause. Now when we talk about from nothing, nothing comes, we're not talking about from space, that's something. From a vacuum, that's something. From blackness, that's something. From darkness, that's something. Okay? Talking about no space, no darkness, no blackness, no time, no nothing, nothing, nothing. All right? So nothing can have no thing as a cause. All right? All things are dependent on something else. This is dependent on something. In fact, this is dependent. This flimsy little folder is dependent on a lot of things. Its origin is dependent on a lot of things. Its continuing existence is depending on a lot of things. Make it too wet, it's destroyed. You make it too hot, it's destroyed. Apply the wrong pressure, it's destroyed. It's very dependent. All things are dependent on something else for their original existence, but also for their ongoing existence. All effects, things, or actions have causes. All causes come before their effects. Okay, that's part of the same one. So this had a cause. Before, this is an effect of all of the things that went into it, the paper, the metal, the wood, and so on and so forth. This is an effect. All those things had to come before this came together. If you go back far enough, you would end with nothing. No thing. So let's follow this. I have this finished folder with the paper in my hand. Clip to it. Prior to this, there were there were a bunch of elements. There was paint, there was some wood, there was some metal, and so on. But really, those things had to be formed. These metal bits here were probably purchased by the factory, then assembled. The wood had already been cut and formed. So prior to the wood, you had trees. Prior to the trees, you had whatever. Keep going back and keep going back and keep going back. Ultimately, you end up with no thing. Nothing. No thing. No space, no blackness, no whatever. Now, there's only one answer to that question, and the answer to that conundrum, I should say, is that there has to be something that exists that does not depend on anything else. That thing or that person we call God, the necessary being. His existence depends on nothing or no one. Nothing can be done to him. There's nothing that tells him how he must act or what he must do at any time. Nothing determines what God does, yet God remains intimately and ultimately personal. Okay? God, let's see what else have I got here. In other case, though, if we're going to go, God contains no potentiality. Okay, introducing a new word. Actuality and potentiality are two words that stand in contrast. God is purely actual, pure actuality, has no potentiality. What do I mean by that? Well, if I look at my coffee cup here, I'm going to take a sip if you don't mind. This cup is warm, it's not hot anymore, but it's potentially cold. It's cool outside, not very much light. That's why I'm struggling with the light today. If I leave the coffee before long, it's going to be cold. If I leave it longer, it will rot and deteriorate, be undrinkable. Okay? So it is potentially something different than it is now. Okay? God has no potentiality. if we and so what God is not potential. Let's come back to that. My coffee cup is potentially different, or that my coffee is potentially different from what it is now. God is not potentially different at all because he has no potentiality in him. Full actuality. Now, what's my next note over here? With respect to God's attribute of perfection, this refers to the fact that he is a fully actualized being. To be fully actualized is to be perfect. So there's no change in God as he becomes more actualized or whatever. He changes in some way. Now, let's take this last one of my comments, not up on the screen here. I've pulled these from articles, reworded them a little bit, and so to put them on the screen, I'll need to properly reference them and their sources and everything. I haven't written all of these straight off the top of my head. I've needed to get some philosophers' wording to get it right. That's the thing about being in the rarefied air. You sometimes need a kind of a Sherpa, to help you cross the mountains and get up there and think, oh, right, okay, here we go. So freedom always involves imperfection, even when said of God. For it concerns an object that is other than the last end of the will as perfectly possessed. What do I mean by that? If I was to say that I had freedom to make decisions, I would definitely not be a fully actualized being. I am potentially different from what I was. Does that make sense? Sure it does. Because I have freedoms, at least to some extent, to make a decision to at what time to take a shower, at what time to go for a run, what time to eat. So all of those things indicate that the current state is not perfect. The current state is in flux. The current state can change. While God has a kind of freedom, his current state cannot change. It does not change. God is always perfect, fully actualized. So God does not go from, okay, at one time I was this, now I am this. That would mean that at one time he had potential, and now he is this. Does that mean that he is actualized? No, it means he still has potential to do something else or to change in some other way. Now I think you can understand why this topic requires such careful wording and why we're only going to scratch the surface, and also why it is so absolutely fascinating. I could study the attributes, these topics, these various ones, the aseity of God, his self-existence, his otherness, his simplicity, his actuality are profoundly captivating topics. They just say, I've just got to get my head around this. The more you ponder them, the more you see the mystery and the wonder of God, and the more you want to know. I dare you, just get yourself started and you won't want to stop. Okay? So God has no potential for change, yet he's fully actualized and fully personal. We're going to jump into that a little more deeply at a later time when I have a better sense of the words I can use. I can grasp it, but I want to communicate it better. So God is not potentially anything at all. All right? God is not potentially anything at all. Now, sometimes you hear people tell stories. They make up stories. And almost always to get attention and to get money and fame and so on. And the stories go like this. Well, I had this experience where they go something like this, right? And they vary, okay? Where God took me out of my body and I was in heaven for a while, and I met all of these people in heaven, and I've come back to tell you what heaven is like. All right. Well, I'm going to say to you that you should not believe any of those stories. While it's a bit impolite to call people who say those things liars, I'm going to be impolite today and say anyone who says that to you is lying. Okay? Or we could be very badly deceived. Maybe he had a very profound, or she had a very profound vision. But I'm really in the lying category myself, making it up. Okay? Now it's very interesting here. Let's a couple of casual comments, then why it relates to this topic. First of all, historically, these stories have been around for a couple of thousand years, nearly, well, certainly in the last millennium anyways, and much more in the last couple of hundred years. Probably people are more gullible, or the printing press, I don't know why. But it's interesting that there was someone who went to heaven who was Spanish, and magnificently and wonderfully, In heaven, they were all talking Spanish. That one, I think it might have been a woman, came back and quoted what people had said to her in Spanish, including some very notable figures of the past. So they're speaking Spanish in heaven. Italian people who tend to go to heaven notice that everybody in heaven is speaking Italian. Well, isn't that odd? Isn't that unusual? I'm certain that any particular person who has done this, I would guess, who's had a so-called heaven visitation, has noted that they've arrived in heaven and not had to learn any new language, not had to learn any new concepts. One of the most famous ones, and I will mention his name, is the American evangelist Jesse Duplantis. Now, Jesse Duplantis, the moment I heard his I went to heaven story, he was full of holes biblically. I knew he was just making it up. Just making it up, just making it up. Jesse, if you hear me, you made it up and you know it, you need to repent. Now, and I said to my friends, he's just making this stuff up. Over time, he's changed the story enough that you know fully that he's making it up. It's not the same story in some key points, which is also interesting. But everybody in heaven, when Mr. Duplantis went there, was speaking English, probably with a Texan accent. Now, why does that relate to this topic? Well, when the Apostle Paul had a similar experience, and he spoke about it in 2 Corinthians, in fear and dread, he basically said, I didn't understand anything that was going on up there. I said they spoke things I couldn't get my head around. Yet God gave him revelation. This would be probably the first thing I would look for. Did you understand what you see? Well, why is that the point? Well, being in the very physical presence of God, who is pure actuality, who is unchanging, yet ultimately intimately personal, would require language much greater than our primitive language. Even our best languages can't handle that because our culture doesn't think that way. We don't think in terms of the eternal and the purely actualized. So being in God's presence in heaven is going to be a learning experience way beyond the comprehension of us today. Why does the Bible say so little about heaven? Because you wouldn't comprehend it. You couldn't get there. You live in a world and around potentialized things, or things with potential, things that can change, things that today will be something different than they were yesterday, even though they look maybe the same. Their temperature would have changed, their position, their whatever. You live in such a world. Now you're in the very presence of God, who is fully actualized. Using and I'm completely convinced, the more I understand this, that no language that we have today would suit. And this is the wonder of eternity. We as created beings are going to be in eternity with the uncreated God, yet relating to him in some magnificent and wonderful way. That's why, wow, that's the wonder of heaven, that you will not comprehend anyway, in any way at all on earth. So a lot of those people who make up stories like that do exactly that. They make up stories. The other thing that's interesting is if you put all those stories together, they don't line up. This is different, that's different, this other thing isn't happening, this guy saw this one saw something else. Jesus looks like this according to one guy, and he looks like that according to the other. Baloney. You don't need to believe it at all. In fact, you shouldn't. And in fact, the curious thing about some of this is some of them talk about speaking to people who are dead. They're dead relatives. Let me tell you, folks, that is completely forbidden by Scripture. Totally forbidden. Yet they're happy to say, oh yeah, went to heaven, saw my Uncle Tom, and he told me what this is going to be like. No. All right. So the difference between everything that we have in the created order is that it has potentiality. It can be something different from what it was. It can be something different from what it is. And not only can be, it will be. It is subject to change. Everything in the creative order, nothing in the created order should be worshipped, because effectively one of the things is it is not other. It also has potentiality. You see this from Elijah's taunt of the prophets of Baal. You see this potentiality. Your God's off doing something. Well, all right. God, on the other hand, is purely and fully actualized. He does not become anything. He's totally beyond potential. He does not change in any way. Nothing can affect what he does. Nothing tells him what to do, or that would be out of him. Now this topic, of course, you could probably tell from my excitement that I love this topic, and I'm coming back to it later, probably going to dig a little more deeply, try to find better words to talk about God's personal communication with us even though he is fully actualized, and how that works and what it means. So we are talking today about pure actuality, a quality only the necessary being God has. My name is Al Person. You can contact me at pastor@mascot.church or in the comments below if they are switched on when I publish the video. God bless you. Let's get back to this topic soon.